The land of Egypt, a place of majestic pyramids, powerful pharaohs, and the echoes of ancient stories. One such story, passed down through generations, speaks of a time when Egypt faced the wrath of forces beyond their comprehension. The story of the Exodus, of Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery, is a tale forever marked by 10 devastating plagues. Each plague, a demonstration of power, a message to Pharaoh, a desperate plea for freedom. Imagine a land where the lifeblood of its people, the Nile River, transforms into a river of blood, a land overrun by pestilence, shrouded in darkness, and terrorized by unimaginable horrors. These weren't merely unfortunate events, but carefully orchestrated calamities designed to test the limits of Pharaoh's resolve and shake the very foundations of his kingdom. This is the story of those plagues, the story of ancient chaos unleashed. Picture the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, its waters giving life to the land, sustaining its people. Now imagine that very river transformed, its shimmering surface turning a gruesome deep red. The fish died, the air filled with the stench of decay, and the Egyptians were left with a horrifying dilemma: thirst in the face of what was once their salvation. This was the first plague, a visceral and terrifying display of power. The Nile, a symbol of life and prosperity, had become a harbinger of death and despair. Even the water stored in jars within their homes turned to blood, a constant reminder of the power that was challenging their pharaoh. If the Nile transformed into blood was unsettling, the second plague was downright unnerving. The land of Egypt, once home to majestic pyramids and bustling cities, became inundated by a living tide frogs. They poured from the Nile, a seemingly endless wave of amphibians. Imagine frogs in your homes, in your beds, in your ovens, and kneading troughs. Every corner you turn, another frog, they're croaking a deafening chorus of chaos. The Egyptians, accustomed to the measured rhythms of the Nile, were now facing an invasion of biblical proportions. The first two plagues targeted the environment and the Egyptians' sense of peace. The third plague, however, was a far more personal assault. Imagine the very dust beneath your feet, the dust that coats everything in the desert land, transforming into a plague of lice or gnats. These tiny insects, barely visible to the naked eye, became a torment upon the Egyptians. They burrowed into their skin, causing an unbearable itching, a constant irritation that defied relief. Even the pharaoh's magicians, attempting to replicate this plague, found themselves defeated, whispering in hushed tones, "This is the finger of God." The air, heavy with the stench of the Nile and the buzzing of countless insects, grew thick with the fourth plague flies. These weren't simply a nuisance, but swarms so dense they darkened the sky. They invaded homes, buzzed relentlessly around heads, and feasted on anything they could find. The Egyptians, already tormented by the previous plagues, were now subject to a relentless onslaught of buzzing, biting insects. The very air became thick with them, a suffocating presence that served as a constant reminder of Pharaoh's defiance. The fifth plague struck at the heart of Egypt's economy and their very survival, their livestock. While previous plagues brought discomfort and unease, this plague brought a chilling silence. Cattle, sheep, horses, all were struck down by a mysterious and deadly disease. Imagine the horror of watching as your livelihood, your source of food and labor, succumbs to an invisible enemy. The fields, once alive with the sounds of grazing animals, were now littered with their carcasses, a grim testament to the power of the plagues. The plagues were relentless, each one seemingly more horrific than the last. The sixth plague was no exception. This time, the Egyptians were afflicted with painful boils, festering sores that covered their bodies. Imagine the agony, the raw, burning pain that came with each movement, each touch. The Egyptians, already weary from the previous plagues, were now subjected to a physical torment that tested their very limits. As if the previous plagues weren't enough, the heavens themselves seemed to open up in anger with the seventh plague. Imagine for a moment a storm of unprecedented ferocity, a tempest that unleashed hail not of ice, but of fire. Crops were obliterated, trees were splintered into kindling, and homes were battered by the relentless assault. The Egyptians, who were so used to the predictable rhythms of their land, were now at the mercy of a force that, honestly, just defied explanation, a terrifying display of nature's raw power. If the hailstorm was a display of raw power, the eighth plague was a calculated assault on Egypt's future. Imagine for a moment a living cloud, so dense it blotted out the sun, descending upon the land. This was the plague of locusts, an unstoppable force of nature. These insects, with their insatiable appetites, devoured every scrap of vegetation that remained after the hail. Fields that had miraculously survived the previous plagues were stripped bare. The Egyptians, already facing famine, now stared into the abyss of utter devastation. The ninth plague was a psychological torment unlike any other darkness, not just the absence of light, but a palpable, suffocating darkness that descended upon Egypt for 3 long days and nights. Imagine being trapped in your home, unable to see your hand in front of your face, the sounds of your own breathing amplified in the oppressive silence. This was a darkness that seeped into your very soul, a darkness that whispered of fear and uncertainty. The 10th and final plague was the most heartbreaking and honestly the most effective. It was a plague of precise and devastating sorrow, the death of the firstborn. Imagine a silence falling over the land, a silence more terrifying than any storm. In every Egyptian home, from the humblest peasant to the pharaoh himself, the firstborn child died. The cries of grief and despair must have echoed through the streets, a symphony of sorrow that finally broke Pharaoh's resolve. The 10 plagues were a turning point in the Exodus story. They weren't just about punishing Pharaoh, but about revealing a power greater than any earthly king. They were about liberation, about a people's fight for freedom, and the lengths to which fate would go to ensure their destiny. The plagues stand as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the power of belief, and the enduring struggle for freedom. They offer a glimpse into a time when the lines between the natural and the supernatural were blurred, when faith was tested, and when the fate of nations hung in the balance. As we reflect on this ancient tale, we're reminded that the lessons of the past can still resonate today. The plagues challenge us to confront our own perceptions of power, freedom, and the very nature of belief.